Hello, and welcome to the Chthonia live stream, which is normally a Wednesday live stream, but today we are actually doing this on a Thursday because of many reasons yesterday, which I'll talk about a little bit, not spend too much time on it. I'm Breach Burke, and I'm the host of Chthonia Podcast, and I like to try to do, when possible, a weekly live stream, and I used to do them on Mondays, and now I've tried to move them to Wednesdays, but Wednesdays probably will be more normal for these because Thursdays I will be teaching in person starting next week. So, and in fact, that's the reason we didn't have a live stream yesterday was because I had to go to the university where I'm teaching. I picked up this class and hello, Alex. And I said hello to Kathleen. Hello, Alex. Hello, my team. Hello, Joanne. All right. We've got three awesome people in the house already. So glad that the three of you are here already. And yeah, yesterday I spent my time doing, I got this HR email at something like 9:50 in the morning. And fortunately, I had opened up my email for my new email for this university. And it was like, hi, can you be here? I'm only here till 12:30. Can you come here and finish all of your HR paperwork? And I'm like, yeah, okay. So it takes me an hour to drive there. So I managed to get there and get everything done. But then I was there for the afternoon. This is a place where I used to work full time. So everybody was like, oh, blah. Everybody wanted to come talk to me and everything. So, and then one of my friends, since I was going to be up there, said, hey, why don't we just go to dinner? So I was there, but as people who are on my other live stream know, I was suffering from a migraine yesterday. And so I was just very like, I'm sure I have like those demon eyes, those red demon eyes. And I was trying to do things and I made it through, but I was annoyed because when I was driving home, I still had a headache. Even though I kind of went up and down during the day. So it was manageable, but I'm like, I'm tired of having a headache. But fortunately, I was okay this morning when I woke up. So yeah, so yesterday ended up being a day of admin stuff that I really didn't expect to do. I am teaching another course starting Monday in persons, Mondays and Thursdays. So that's, yeah, my timetable, just trying to pull in some extra money, but also, it'll be an interesting topic. But I'm not going to get into that here because it's not really substantive to Chthonia as it is. So the other things that are new Chthonia website is up. I was looking at it on my phone and I'm like, the bookstore page needs some adjustment with the images and stuff because they're too big for the phone kind of width or resolution. So I have to work that out. But I did transfer everything, including the email, over to Wix. So everything is there now and much cheaper because I don't have any e-commerce hooked up to it. All of my links are to outside sites and outside places for books and stuff that I have for sale. So that's all there. And I plan to work on it. There's like a regular blog, adding more stuff to it. And when I, in my spare time, right? At some point I will get everything kind of sorted out. But as those of you who know me know that I have a lot going on right now. And with the ISFM, we do have some interesting new ideas while we're not going to have a regular term, I may start to have certain monthly for Patreon paid subscribers. It may be free, but for people who are, anybody else, it could be some nominal fee like $10 or something, nothing very expensive. Thinking about having talks, and I don't know if I want to do it once or twice a month. I would love to do it weekly, but that could be ambitious. But I'm thinking about trying to put something together to talk about certain topics. So look out for that. That's something that's coming up in the near future, I hope, because I would like to be doing something with ISFM, not just letting it sit there until 2026. So yes, and hello. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is the podcast that was released this week was on Chthonia. And I refer to Chthonia as the Hecate of the city. Now, as we mentioned in the podcast, Chthonia is not just associated with Hecate. She also, in some writers, associate her with Persephone. She's often referred to as daughter of Demeter. And in other places, she is compared to Artemis. But if we followed the Artemis podcast, which I did re-release recently, we edited that, or Allie did the editing on that, and then I kind of went and did the video piece and all of that. That Artemis and Hecate are very close. I've often referred to Hecate as the underworld Artemis. So, and again, you can listen to that podcast for the full details on that. But her connection to Hecate is interesting because Hecate is a goddess of the crossroads. And Enodia her name literally means on the street or in the road. So when we are talking about Enodia, it's not, and her role and function actually is quite similar to Hecate. In Greece, you would see things called the Hecateia or Hekateion in the singular, which were these kind of statues of Hecate that were placed at the entrances to houses. And very similar statues exist with respect to Enodia. And with Enodia, in fact, Sarah Iles Johnston mentions one in which an iron key was actually found in the statue. And we all know that Hecate is also associated with being the keeper of the keys. So there's definitely, I mean, some people even would suggest that Enodia is an epithet or a description, that the descriptor that's added to Hecate as a goddess. So Hecate Enodia, Hecate of the road. But Enodia seems to have some things kind of in her own right. Asteria is associated with Hecate, Apollo, and Artemis. Yes, with Hecate, Apollo. Yes, well, that's true. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of cross connections that we see there. When we're talking specifically about Enodia, I think the idea of having a deity who is exclusively associated with, well, not exclusively, Enodia has an epithet that refers to her as the Enodia of the city. And we talk about this in the podcast because there's the idea that's explicitly stated that Enodia seems to have to do with city homes rather than something you might see out in a rural community somewhere. And that, to me, seems to be significant, especially with respect to Sarah Iles Johnston's discussion in The Restless Dead, where she poses the question pretty early on in chapter 1. And in fact, I have it here, so I'm going to just read it. It's only a couple of sentences. It's not a whole lot. But she talks about like many people, the Greeks believed from a very early time that some special dead, such as the unburied and those who had died young, were angry with the living, had some means of harming them. In our earliest narrative sources, the dead only do so through the agency of divine entities such as the Erinyes, so the Furies. It's important to remember there. Correlative to this is the fact that from very early times, the Greeks, like many other people, believed that the dead benefited from and indeed demanded attention from the living. Most of the dead, however, are presented in these earliest sources as being weak, unable to affect the living, as in Anticlea told Odysseus when he visited the underworld, separated from the living by an uncrossable river. And I do talk about this in the beginning of Death and the Maiden, where I kind of give the 5 elements of the archaic dead. And one of them most certainly is that they are not able to, that they're very weak. But they do seem to have an association with the future and future telling. They're not necessarily aware of what's going on in the present. In fact, it's very likely that they're not. And they only can be invoked. There seems to be, at least if we believe the Odyssey, there's a kind of necromantic ritual that goes on there where Circe slits the throat of a black ram, and the blood from that is what the dead drink from to be able to speak, because there's the implication there that the dead, that they need blood, like blood is the life force, that they need that blood to be able to connect with in any way, shape, or form, which is why this tends to be associated with necromantic type of rituals. But it's interesting, yeah, because it says the narrative sources from the classical period. She says, we begin to see evidence for 2 new beliefs. First, the dead themselves can be a threat. They need not always work through agents such as the Erinyes, though they can still do this as well. Second, they can be called back into action by the living in a variety of ways, including some ways that we might label as magical. They can be used by the living as sources of help, as the Persian queen uses Darius, for example, or as a means of harming others. Okay, so she kind of goes through this, and then she says, in general, all of these observations suggest a hypothesis. Greek beliefs evolved from a system in which the dead were relatively weak and unlikely to affect the world of the living, except under very special circumstances, and then of their own volition into a system where the dead were an active force in the world of the living and could be called into action when the living chose. Okay, now she questions this, and she also deals with all of the objections to this. And one of the pieces of evidence that she has for this is that Homer, the Odyssey episode notwithstanding, doesn't talk a lot about the idea of necromancy or necromantic rituals. We kind of get the idea that this kind of thing went on. A really good book on this is Dan Ogden's book called Greek and Roman Necromancy, where he goes into a lot of the texts, and he also goes into all the methods that they used. Not just this kind of a thing, but dream incubation and stuff like that, which was all methods of trying to communicate with dead. But it doesn't seem to be something that Homer talks about very much, that like I said, the Odyssey episode kind of accepted. And it's not something, and her belief is that the reason Homer doesn't talk about it is because he probably didn't know a whole lot about it. And what she says here, I believe it is best to look for the simplest explanation for Homer's omissions. I trust the brief discussion that she's just had has demonstrated that any approach other than assuming Homer was unacquainted with the beliefs we see well attested in later sources requires elaborate and unlikely presumptions. So what she's saying here is that, okay, there was a period of time in the Archaic period, and you know, you could argue things too, like, you know, writing was new, language was new, at least to the Greeks. Certainly before that, you have other examples of writing, you know, Hittite cuneiform scripts. You have Babylonian, Sumerian kinds of scripts that exist. But writing as such, alphabetic writing as such, really begins around the same era as Homer. Okay, Hesiod, Homer. Hesiod's a little earlier than Homer. But we have this idea where, yeah, you don't see any evidence for this at all. And there's another scholarly article I've read, and I don't have the citation in front of me. I'd have to go, I think I saw it in Drew Library. I'd have to go look it up again. But it was one about where there was some assertion that ideas about raising the dead had to do with, came from Persia. Now, some might argue Egypt as well, because a lot of the beliefs that came into Greece at that period of time, especially stuff having to do with the mystery cults, seems to be either Egyptian or Persian in origin. So, okay, so what do the dead have to do with all this? Well, one of the things that these particular deities are there to avert is is ghosts coming into your house, basically, because they're both goddesses connected with ghosts in some fashion. But what's interesting to me is, and this is the question that she asks, is she's like, why at this period of time do we suddenly start hearing about this? Why do the dead suddenly have this agency that we really don't hear about before? It's like, yeah, they're dead. They're just a shadow. They're gone. You know, we don't hear about this as kind of a regular thing. But she also points out that when we do start to hear more about it regularly in literature of these kinds of episodes, and you hear about it a lot more in the Roman period, that there's not the sense that there's anything wrong with it. Like now we would look at something like that and go, oh, that's a terrible thing. Well, or unless you're a necromancer, right? But there's definitely the suggestion here that that this is something that was to some degree an accepted practice. And we also see this with, there's a lot in which the way, especially when we got to eras of the curse tablets and things like that, that you could, you're basically asking a deity for whatever it is that you need. And, but her point was that previously, it wasn't like the dead themselves came and did anything. It was always the Erinyes, okay, who are the Furies. The Furies are the ones who are sent because the Furies are the boundary setters. Now, I think this is really interesting in the sense that the boundary setters seem to be feminine. Now, those who actually call upon the dead, the goetes, who are the ones who would do that, really traditionally had always been men. But later on, again, you start reading about sources where they refer to these female witches who actually engage in this practice. And you have some very prominent examples from other cultures, probably most notably the Witch of Endor, right? In the Bible, brings back the ghost of Saul to in this particular episode where they're trying to make decisions in this particular about this particular battle or trying to get certain information from him, but that's what they're getting information from. They're trying to get information from him about the future. Okay, there's this necromantic practice. And of course, from a biblical perspective, they say, well, this kind of thing is forbidden. In Greek practice, later on, you see Plato having a kind of disdain for this kind of practice, saying things like, well, kind of the same things people might say today, like, oh, well, it's probably just faked. And, kind of along the lines of, this is just somebody who's trying to make a quick buck off somebody by saying, oh, give me this and I'll, raise your dead uncle or whatever. And they'll ask them some questions. So, but the question is about why is the ghostly, why is the otherworldly, why is this suddenly more threatening? And I think that's really more the key question than the specifics there. Although, again, the connection to the feminine is interesting, and the idea that you have these feminine underworld deities who are the ones who are able to avert. And there might be a number of reasons why that might be the case, which I'm going to get into. But I did want to talk about a few things here. Now, first of all, yeah, Chthonia and Hecate, when they put the statues in front of something, perhaps ghosts and its association with history. Possibly, but we'll get into some of the specifics here that I've identified. But I think with Hecate, it's okay. So you have this idea that they are there as these protective forces that stand at the gates. And with Chthonia, you particularly have it connected to the city. Now, I find that particularly to be of import, mainly because, and again, as I address in my book, which I do have it here, there's a sense that okay, there's the tribal household, the oikos, the tribal household, and I do talk about this in the podcast. And then there's also the polis. The polis is the city. Now we might have referred to it as the city-state. Cities were breeding grounds for monotheism. They were, but you're thinking, well, that's a little bit way beyond the period that we're going, because monotheism is something that we see kind of almost as a result of empire. And at this point, we're just literally talking about the organization of tribal states into city-states, like the city of Athens, for example, as it becomes this kind of a little bit more of a metropolitan kind of place. And of course, this is, you've got the Mediterranean Sea, you've got the Aegean Sea, you've got all this trade that goes on, people going back and forth. And so you have this concept within these tribal cultures where you have these households, you have these kings that have these lineages. And these kings are, and now you're introducing people from other cultures who may be coming to live in your city. Okay. This is where we're starting to introduce this concept of the foreign with respect to other peoples and other cultures. Now, surely all of the ancient peoples were not unfamiliar with people of other cultures, because especially if they had access to a route by sea and by the places where they could go to other places, they would be interacting with people. And if they were more nomadic, they were always going to be looking for land that was fertile, land that was good for their livestock. When agriculture becomes a thing, land that's good for their crops. I mean, all of these things become a factor about where people settle. And Thucydides talks about in his histories about how certain places you didn't see a whole lot of warfare or a lot of battle. And interestingly, Athens being one, because he said the land was not very good. It wasn't the best farmland. It wasn't the best for grazing. It wasn't the best for a lot of things, at least at that period in time. So he said, generally, if you picked a place like that for whatever reason, you were relatively safe because you didn't have anybody trying to fight you for that land. Because if you had a land that was nice and rich in resources, then people were going to fight you for it. Kind of the same reason people fight wars today, right? You have oil that we want, we're going to go fight with you, right? I mean, whatever resources you have that people need, your land is less secure when other people see that and say, "Ooh, I want that." So that's certainly one way that you deal with things when we talk about ideas of sovereignty. Okay, and sovereignty is connected to the feminine, which also is kind of an interesting thought. Sovereignty has to do with rule or establishing a rule or a boundary around a particular place. And then defending that boundary is certainly part of that. It's certainly very much part of the idea of maintaining your thing. So going to war is one way in which you defend yourself against, say, what we'll call foreign invaders. Because presumably the people invading are not people from your tribe. Otherwise, if they were, you'd be welcoming them in, right? But welcoming people is another way to handle it. And that is the idea of guest friendship, which we've talked about many times on this live stream, and many times, probably more times than people are probably sick of hearing about it. But the idea of xenia and that of guest friendship is that you welcome the foreigner into your home, and you offer them gifts, and you feast, and you share stories, and your bards sing, their bards sing songs, and your bards sing songs, and you exchange information, and you know all about each other. And the idea is that when that guest leaves, if you are a foreign guest in their land, that they will then take you in as an act of guest friendship. This was like a kind of, I don't know whether it would have been spoken or unspoken. I don't think, certainly it's not formally written about anywhere, but this definitely does seem to be a value of that particular period of time where people would engage in acts of guest friendship. And again, not limited to the Greeks or to their neighbors or the different Greek tribal kingdoms that they might have called Achaean in the Iliad. It's not limited to them either. You certainly see it in Asia Minor. The idea with the Iliad is there's an attestation. And she says, I love the guest friendship concept, is what Kathleen says. Yeah, it's a nice idea, isn't it? It's the idea that, you welcome the stranger. And the thing is, it's a biblical idea too. We tend to, it's interesting when we can become xenophobic about certain things, and there has been a lot about the Bible and separatism, but it does actually say at some point, and I meant to look up the verse before I came on and I haven't yet, maybe somebody else will know it. But there is a verse that says you welcome the foreigner, into your land because you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. It's something to that effect. So the idea is that you yourself were a foreigner, so you are a stranger, so you welcome the foreigner. So it is a biblical concept as well. It's not something that's alien to biblical thinking. And Alistair says, you never know when the stranger might be Odin. It's true. Yeah, and you know what it does? It makes me think of something. It makes me think also of what Crowley has said, which was when he had said, be careful of how you treat a beggar because he may be a king. Right? Yeah, there's this idea that you don't know who the stranger is, right? And we may judge people based on things that are, the old "don't judge a book by its cover," right? If you want to be cliche about it, but. Okay, so it's interesting to me that okay, so we have this idea you can manage the foreign through, if people come to steal your land, obviously you're going to war with them, right? And Joanne says same for angels. Yes, true. And Chris says Kuhn. Yeah, same for angels. Yeah, it's that's true. You don't know when an angel is coming to visit you, and yeah, you don't know when you're being visited by a divine being, right? So always be careful of how you treat people. So that's just generally good advice, I think, right? But okay, so generally speaking, this is the kind of ways that we deal with things. You have people who are making war, or you have this idea of guest friendship. And with guest friendship, we have this sense that you welcome the stranger. And as I've said before, it's very similar to the idea of pact making with deities. Because the idea is that I'm going to do something nice for you, or I'm going to give you something, and that you're going to give me something in return. It's the gift giving principle that we would use with, and this is the way you negotiate it. What in your environment is alien to you in some way? You do it. There's different ways you can approach it. You can approach it in a friendly way, or you can approach it in a hostile way. But you would find as we started to build up city-states, especially when you look at laws that Solon made for Athens and laws that were coming up probably closer to the classical period, especially when you started to have Greek drama, competitions with Greek drama and tragedy and comedy. And these were often connected with Dionysus festivals because that was also a way of managing the chaos of the Dionysus festival, was to make some kind of a formal drama where people could get on stage and do outrageous things, or we think about Aristotle's idea of catharsis, right? That you watch a play and somehow, well, it's the same thing when you watch a TV show, when you watch a movie, or you read a certain book, and there's something in there that resonates with you. It allows you to have an expression of something maybe without you having to do it. It's like somebody else was doing it for you. It's vicarious in a way. It's cathartic, right? It allows you that release without you necessarily having to take any particular kind of action other than being the observer. So we have this this idea here, but it was interesting because the laws that were surrounding, I'm remembering this in particular, the laws surrounding the Dionysus festivals, there were two or three different ones where they actually had realizations from a distance, like, well, right, exactly, yes, that's correct. And I think what it is when, okay, I remember in particular that there were certain festivals, and I think the Linnea might have been one of them, where foreigners who were living in Athens could participate. But there were others in which foreigners and slaves were not allowed to participate in Greek drama, which I thought was interesting. There's this idea here that, so my point being is that laws come into place where foreigners are kind of put in the same class as slaves, and where they are actually explicitly excluded from certain things because they are not native to the area. Now, of course, in modern times, we recognize that there are laws. If you are a citizen of a particular nation, there are rights that you have that people who are not citizens don't have. Okay, that's the way we do things here. And those laws may be more or less draconian, depending on how people feel towards immigration in that particular space. Okay. And I think this is kind of a relevant thing to think about, especially in one of the relevant things to think about, because immigration is definitely such a big topic, not just in America, but we also see these kinds of issues coming up when you have a rise of the right in other places. A lot of it seems to be connected to this maintenance of boundaries and this fear of the other. So I always feel it's very instrumental to say, well, where does the fear of the other is coming from? And he says, no kidding. Yeah. And it's, yeah. So what is this fear of the other? That's literally this question that kind of even drove the whole creation of Chthonia, because in my particular book, I'm looking at it from the point of view of fear of the feminine, but that's certainly not the only aspect of this. But the feminine piece is interesting. So, okay, so I made some notes for myself here. And okay, one of the things I was looking at here is, okay, what does it mean when we talk about being native to a place? Now, we think about being native is, well, I'm a citizen. You know, I have the paperwork that says that I was born here and I belong to this country. Typically, the idea that you're born in a place makes you native. But there will be people who say, well, no, depending on, you know, if your parents came from another place and then they came here and they weren't from here, but then you were born here, like these talk about anchor babies and stuff, like if you're born here, are you really from here? Are you really from somewhere else? Or let's just back up even further and let's just talk about colonialism. Okay. USA being a perfect example, because obviously there was an indigenous population that was already here when Europeans of all stripes arrived on the shores, both in Canada and in what we think of now as the continental United States and even Mexico. And so, yeah, there was already indigenous populations that were often pushed out. And so the question then becomes, and I remember seeing cartoons, okay? There was a cartoon book of ones from the newspapers in the late 1800s when you had the Statue of Liberty and you had the whole idea of the U.S. as the land of opportunity and we welcome the immigrants, right? There was that whole influx. Probably a lot of those of us who live here, probably our ancestors came here during that time, coming to Ellis Island, coming to different places. And there was the idea that you were coming here to America because it was a free and open place and there was opportunity. But it was interesting because there were political cartoons at the time of the men kind of dressed up like the Monopoly guy, you know, with the top hat and the little monocle, standing on the harbor with their arms folded, like you don't belong here. You're not native. He said, I heard the French want the statue back. Don't blame them, really. It's like, yeah, it's like, yeah. So they're, you know, standing there on the shores, like, you know, we're Americans and you don't belong here. And standing behind them were Native Americans standing there like this. And we've seen more modern versions of this, but there were even versions of this cartoon back in the late 1800s. So there's always this idea of what does it mean that you're native here? If you're a colonial person who kicked out the indigenous people and you came here, then, you know, what gives you more of a right other than that you used force or trickery or whatever to get things? You know, so, and this, again, this is not strictly an American phenomena, but it's, you know, the whole question of colonialism raises the idea of who is native. Even if we want to go back to this period in time, I mean, who populated that area? Was it Ionians? Was it Aeolians? There were a number of other groups that ended up populating that area, and which ones are native, right? Who owns the rights and what does it have to do with? So, yeah, so the question of who is native is always an interesting one if you really want to think about it. So of course, then we also, that ties into what do we think of as other. Um, Now you can have people who were born into a particular country, but if you have a dominant, well, whether usually it's like a racial, economic, and gender kind of characteristic that will be recognized or at least assumed to be dominant, whether they're dominant in the sense of demographically being the most of them, or whether they're dominant just in the sense of their way of life is considered to be the normal thing, right? And frequently what we talk about is, white male privilege and things like that. And again, that doesn't mean all white men are like, jerks who, it just, but there is a culture that kind of naturally and unconsciously privileges people of certain races and certain classes, and also of just, and sometimes just, having to do with gender as well. The idea of men getting paid more, say, for example, or but even like just being certain. I remember having a friend from Dubai who had said to me, "Oh, you ought to come here and look for work here." And of course, I didn't really have any desire to go to Dubai, but I just said, "Well, I don't, as an American, I don't know what I would do." And she goes, "Oh no, you're a white person. You'll get a job easy." And I'm just like, she says, "Yeah, nobody wants to give jobs to the natives. They just want to, they want, rich white Americans." And I'm like, I mean, unfortunately, there's probably some truth to that, but I just find that appalling. Because again, that's kind of reversing the idea of native. Like we don't care about the natives, especially if the natives are dark skinned, right? You actually even find that in countries. I've seen examples of that in places where people, maybe varying degrees of whatever their, the indigenous or the typical skin tone is of the population, and the people with the lighter version of that tend to be favored over people with the darker version of that. That's actually a whole separate question or a whole separate conversation, but it does get into the way that we create hierarchies and the way that we have bias. Okay, and of course, economics is a big thing too. Somebody with a lot of money, two people could commit the same crime. Whether you have money or not is going to determine, whether or not you're going to pay for that crime, generally speaking. Occasionally what's actually just happens, but, we all know that a lot of times people with money and privilege, it's just kind of like, oh, well, we'll give them a pass, and oh, well, but they're this, or oh, it might do that. We can't do that to them. But, anybody else does the tiniest little thing and it's like, you're in jail for 20 years. So yeah, there's not necessarily a sense of equity when it comes to this stuff, but this has to do with a lot with how we treat the other. And it's like, okay, so what makes someone other? Other would indicate, first of all, there's this idea of non-dominance. Okay, you're not the dominant gender, you're not the dominant race. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the financial resources, that is also a thing that puts you in the underclass, because you are not somebody who is able to, you don't have the riches that would make people want to trade with you or want to I don't know, curry favor with you for something. Money and power often go together, unfortunately, but that's often the way that it is. And so poorer people have to find other ways to gain power for themselves. Right? So that varies. But the definition of other is always an interesting one. So when you put these kinds of statues out and you say we're trying to avert things, there's a couple of layers of that, because majority versus minority, whatever that means. Well, exactly. And there's something subjective about it, but there's often sociologically considered to be somebody who's considered a majority or a minority, right? Again, whether that's like demographically true or not. So what I think is interesting is that okay, so you have this idea, you have this idea of something that's going to avert, and you have a particular goddess whose powers of aversion seem to be particularly connected to the city. And as I've just mentioned, the city versus the oikos, or the household, or the tribal family, they're different things. It's very easy for someone who is a great king of a place to bring a foreigner in of some esteem and say, oh, yes, you are welcome into my house, and so forth. When you're talking about a variety of people coming in from other places with different customs, different cultures, and you are a place that centers around a particular set of deities, you have festivals and sacrifices, and you have things that are that are important to keeping to the maintenance of the city, to the protection and health of the city, and the prosperity of the city. And you have to worry that, is there something that's being introduced here that is not, or someone maybe who's going to have something offensive to our gods, or to to our, really that kind of is code almost to our way of life, to what we think of as normal. Although sometimes, as we see too, the gods of other nations can become assimilated in some ways. Probably goddesses like Hecate originally had different functions and then kind of got absorbed into the cult of the 12, as we think about it in Athens and in places like that, where, because there was a different cult of the 12 in different places. Different people were part of that pantheon, or different gods were part of that pantheon, or at least there was some variety. So there's this idea of averting that which may come from the foreign, something which may inadvertently bring a taint or an impurity, or or some kind of something that might violate a taboo of some kind, and it would be unknown to you because you don't know enough about that, or you don't know enough of the effects of their presence in a particular culture. So this seems to be what the fear is. There's this idea of preserving, not being able to, worried about what that change is going to bring. And I just think it's really interesting that she's pointing out that this also seems to be connected with a greater fear of the power of the dead. So it's like, what do the dead have to do with this? Well, in a lot of these cultures, the dead were, how the dead are treated in a particular culture can be very, very instructive. And most cultures, I don't want to say most, there were many cultures that had a real hard time negotiating death or accepting death as being part of life. And frequently, the way that one of her chapters is in this book has a wonderful title, to honor and to avert. Okay. So this is the kind of the way in which the dead are managed or are handled. You honor the dead, especially you honor your ancestors. And this is something that we definitely see. I mean, nowadays people go and, go to graves and put flowers on graves and stuff like that. But certainly, as we know, in some cultures, we think about the Mexican Dios de los Muertos celebrations and so forth. And you have other examples of this around the world, where the ancestral tombs are decorated and food is brought. And, there's a lot of different things that are done, because the idea is that you want to remember. Certainly there's the idea of memory, which contributes to your immortality to some degree. I mean, that is kind of what we're trying to do. We want to be remembered, our identity for the person that we were, or the family that we belong to, or whatever. It's why genealogy is important to a lot of people, their ancestry and their history, because there's this idea of the honor of the dead. But the dead, as she noted, there are some categories of dead people who are problematic. Well, first of all, if you do not respect the graves of your ancestors and you do not do the proper rituals, or when somebody dies and you don't observe the proper funerary rites, you have to risk that person coming back to you. And you were talking about the wisdom of ancestors. Yes. Well, yes, exactly. But you have this, so there's this idea, like, for example, okay, when Patroclus dies in the Iliad, he comes back as a ghost to Achilles saying, you need to do my funerary rites because I can't cross over into the underworld. And of course, he's very, very disturbed by these dreams. And, they have to try to get some kind of a stay or a pass so that they can actually perform these funeral rites. And, you see it with others, soldiers as well. If they die in the Odyssey, trying to remember who it was, but it was one of Odysseus's men who falls off the ship and is killed, goes to them and says, you need to perform burial rites for me. Because the idea was that if you didn't have the proper rites, you did not have the proper tools, or the money for Charon the ferryman, or you didn't have whatever it was that they expected that you needed to be able to cross over into Hades. Because obviously, so then you would be a roaming ghost. You'd be the restless dead. And so if you weren't taken care of after death properly, and if you died and did not have proper rites, or if you died before your time, okay? And this frequently connects in with women, because we have the idea of women who die in childbirth, That's one example. Or girls who die before they're able to become wives, mothers, things like that in that culture. The idea was that a girl who died, like who was a virgin, often became associated with the Erinyes. She became an assistant to the Furies. And this connection in with the feminine and that which you're trying to avert is quite interesting. So you have this idea of the of these boundary setters that are all feminine in nature. Okay, and you have these certain rules around the dead where it's like, okay, if all the proper things haven't been done, they can come back and they can bother you. That's so interesting with the moon and wisdom. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the feminine and its connection to that, its connection to the underworld. And what I was talking about before was that I was thinking there's a number of, we were talking about a number of possible reasons why this could be the case. Okay, so one possible thing that we can think about here is that women are the ones who, women are the ones who give birth to children, right? Women are the ones who have a uterus and who have all the appropriate organs to carry and deliver a child, okay? So, and we all know that social role, especially when we were talking about the oikos, about the time of the household as being central, the woman would be central. This is why the Furies found matricide in particular to be such a terrible thing. You could not kill the mother because the mother is the one who is the creator. I mean, the role of the man may be acknowledged, maybe not, but the idea was that the woman was the one who bore the children, who bore the heirs, who continued the family line and created that immortality just through the act of giving birth. Okay, so it could well be that you have the power of women as being able to give birth, and as women give birth, they may also have the power over death. You know, life and death are not necessarily viewed as separate. Probably, realistically speaking, they're not really that different. They're really kind of two sides of the same coin. We tend to see them as two very, very distinct things in this culture, probably because we have a Christian backdrop. I say particularly Christian. I mean, it's not, there's other monotheistic leanings. Islam might have this to some degree as well. But you have this idea that, well, certainly in Christianity, St. Paul will say how Christ conquered death, right? There's the whole idea of the harrowing of hell and you know, this kind of release. I mean, that's the whole doctrine of salvation, right? The idea that you are saved from death in some fashion. And yet that eventually, obviously, since people die, because that's what the whole thing about being mortal is, the idea is that somehow this is a resurrection of souls at the end time or something. You know, there's different, you know, apocalyptic, eschatological kind of ways of looking at this. But you know, but it's interesting because the woman here, it may well be seen, even though the goete is somebody who is the man who sings the songs of the dead, sending them to the grave and potentially bringing them back. Women in particular may have this connection because it's like, well, if she can produce a life, maybe she can take one too, you know, or maybe, you know, and so a lot of these boundaries and these rules, life itself is a boundary, right? You know, you have the fates, the idea of the three fates who will spin the thread of, you know, they spin the thread of life, they measure it, and then they cut it. And that's your fate. That's the time that you are allotted according to fate. And again, these are feminine spirits who actually will be connected to this. So yeah, women may have been perceived just by the virtue of being able to give birth to have this power over death. Now, when it comes to the idea of the foreign woman, yeah, to me you came, and to you you shall return. Yes, right. That's the other version of Gaia. To me, it could, right, the Gaia connection, because when we're talking about Gaia, you're talking about the Earth Mother. The Earth Mother, at least in that particular thing, lamentation only used to be sung by women, I think. Yes, Alistair, and that's another good point. The keening. Keening is only something that is done by women, usually particularly older women. And in fact, that was some of the laws that Solon had instituted about who could actually participate in keening. because sometimes and there was times when you would hire professional keeners, you would hire women to come in. And one thing, I think Jake Stratton Kent might have talked about this, was how he had said that the goete more or less roughly translates to howling. And it's like this idea that keening and howling is a sound that guides the dead to the underworld. That lamentation is something that's required. You see it in Egypt too, when you see the idea of Isis and Nephthys singing these lamentations, okay, for the dead. The idea is that is like a song that guides one to the next world. So the goete is somebody as the howler, so to speak. I mean, again, that's not always the most perfect translation, but if we think about that idea of that, then the idea would be, again, just kind of what we were just saying about women and childbirth. If you can bring the dead to the graves, then perhaps you can sing the song to bring them back, right? Or to cause them to appear, or to get information from them, or there were a variety of ways that necromantic work was done. But the idea, very, very similar in concept too. Do you find a connection with Isis and Hecate? There probably might be a little more tenuous, maybe. A little more tenuous, maybe. I mean, I'm sure that you will probably find somewhere in the Empire literature, you will probably find something, especially as Osiris becomes connected with Serapis and becomes connected with, to a certain degree, even with Yahweh, Jehovah, and Jupiter, Jove. Probably, I don't know that such texts exist, but you'll probably find texts. Well, I don't know, maybe the PGM, right? The PGM maybe to some degree will take some of these deities and kind of, they all become kind of different versions of the same thing. So if there's certain aspects of Isis as in her underworld kind of a role, or underworld guide role, might be part of that. Transformation, you're talking about Pluto. Yeah, well, Pluto or Hades, certainly anything connected to the underworld is transformative. And Pluto, of course, having to do with Pluton, or Plutos, so that has to do with wealth as well, the wealth that comes from underground. But in any case, back to what I was going to say about this, the foreign element, okay? There's a verse, and I actually have it, marked it in my book. And Alex saying, I remember JSK describing women as wailing or wailers in the scope of Goetia, and how women were introduced at some point. Very interesting. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, Jake is probably the best was the best authority on that, because he was the one who made a really extensive study of that. But yeah, at some point that role kind of shifts over, and we see it as something that's more connected to women. It's quite possible that funeral keening was always a thing that women did. But I think maybe the actual act of bringing the dead back might have been more associated with men. It's not 100% clear to me, but his work on that is definitely the best to read on that, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so I'm writing this thing, and I said, what was it? Okay, it says in Proverbs 7 is the allegory of folly, portrayed as the quote unquote loose woman who decks out her bed with fine Egyptian linen. There's the implication of sensuality and worldliness in the description. Folly is described as a woman dressed as a harlot and wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home, now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. This is Proverbs 7, 10 to 12, verses 10 to 12. Or lines 10 to 12. The young man is warned, her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. Okay, so there's definitely this idea, and also, as I mentioned here, that the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible, the New Testament is entirely in Greek, but this was with the Old Testament translation. Loose is often translated as strange. So there's the idea that strange and or foreign women are loose. Okay, the idea of them being loose is implied. That woman, this is the woman, the sensual woman will lead you down to Sheol. Okay, which is kind of like the ancient Judaic equivalent of Hades, basically, or of Pluto. It's the same idea. And as it's been noted, these places are not hell. Okay. These places are not hell. It's just simply that being dead's not a very cheery existence. It's not fun to be dead. That was kind of the moral of the story, that the underworld was kind of a gloomy place, strange, witchy, and loose. Yes. And I'm going to get to the witchy thing, sort of anticipating me there. There's this idea that this was going to be the way to death, the way to the underworld. And again, but there wasn't the idea of judgment after death. That was another thing. It wasn't like you died, and later on there became the idea of reward and punishment in the afterlife. That's something that we see really kind of as an outgrowth of philosophy and ethical thinking, and also just kind of the idea that people didn't like the idea that if people did bad things, that they weren't punished. If you saw somebody who, did all of these terrible things and never saw any justice, there's the idea of, well, how are the gods just? If dike is the other thing besides xenia, dike meaning a word for justice in Greek, if dike is that important, and if the gods are just in the way that they do things, then how come there are people, it's the old, why do bad things happen to good people? And there was that book, that very popular book. And, but then also, why do bad people get away with things, or at least seem to? So ideas about karma, ideas about, we feel that actions have to have consequences. It's Socrates in the Phaedo, where he says, if there is judgment in life, there must be judgment in death. Well, that's not necessarily the case, but nonetheless, we have to feel somehow that in order to maintain the balance of things, that there has to be some kind of justice somewhere, right? There has to be some kind of balance. So when you introduce a foreign element, you introduce an element of chaos. Ironically, justice, nemesis, goddess. Yeah, actually, and it's interesting because Nemesis, in addition to the Erinyes, Nemesis was the other one who was frequently sent to create that balance or to avenge, right? People who had too much fortune, who hadn't earned it, you would be, that would be something that would happen, they would deal with. But this interesting idea about the feminine woman, the idea that sensuality, and we do have to think about the way in which lust or love, if you want to call it love, or some loose definition of love, in the way in which that can lead us out of our rational faculties, right? The way in which somebody who's seduced by lust or seduced by something can be taken aside from what would be perhaps their normal duties, and they would then their power would sort of be given over to a woman who had enticed them. You do see examples of this, where the kings, they fall madly in love with this foreign woman, and she encourages them, oh, get rid of this one and do this. Like there's all kinds of stories about this kind of idea of this feminine influence as being somehow negative. And this idea that having these foreign ways are a big, Rosh national solar energy. Well, yeah, exactly. Rational, masculine, solar, active, fiery. Yeah, that's all part of that yang energy, really, if we want to think about it that way. But I think it's just interesting that women are, that the idea is that you're introducing a chaotic element in this way. And you're introducing this kind of irrationality. And yeah, to talk about it as rational solar energy is actually quite good, because that's the whole point. When you start to introduce rationality into an irrational system, when you start to say that, like I said, like the philosophers did, where, they're the ones that start to question the ethics of the gods. Well, I think it's terrible that Zeus cheats on his wife. He's a poor example of a leader, right? I mean, that's the most obvious one. We kind of look at it because we start looking at the gods as embodiments of rational intellect. Even if you have a concept of God now, where you might say like, I believe in God, and I believe God rewards the good and punishes the wicked, or whatever. You're assigning a rationality to God. But think about it: when somebody dies, and let's just say it's a young person or a child or something, and what does the priest always say? Well, God works in mysterious ways, right? So God's not necessarily rational, right? And if you really read the Bible for what it says, I've recently been watching Dan McClellan's channel, which is quite interesting. He's a cognitive scientist of religion, And he's got a great little channel now where he goes and addresses certain questions and videos and certain assertions that about the Bible and so forth, and says, nope, not true, not true, not true. And he pulls all the evidence out, you know? Yeah, sort of demonizing Venus. Well, Venus kind of gets Venus, Aphrodite, and that kind of a thing. Yes, you do see it demonized to a certain degree within philosophy, or certainly probably a little bit later than that, when you start to get into ideas about, there were certain writers and certain philosophers who absolutely despised women. Hesiod's one. I want to say Xenocrates was another one. They don't like women. I mean, you read their writings, and all they can talk about is just how awful women are. So, you know, a lot of the philosophers did not care for that. And in fact, Plato's Symposium, there's a lot of time spent about, you know, what it means to fall in love and why people fall in love with each other and that kind of stuff. But strictly speaking, it's not something, you know, it's the influence of Venus, right? Yeah, Venus, who comes in and creates this desire. She's demonized quite a lot, actually, in Roman literature, where all these bad things that happen because Venus decided she's going to extend her domain, like the abduction of Persephone. You know, they say in one of the versions of that story, Venus decided, or Aphrodite wanted to extend her domain to the underworld. So what does she do? She gets her son to go fire an arrow at Hades. And of course, the first thing Hades sees is Persephone. And he says, ooh, got to have that. The way in which it makes us behave in ways that can be, that can create disorder. You were mentioning King James there. Okay, so the idea of the foreign woman here. So you have this idea of these feminine underworld figures that set boundaries. And then you have this idea also of the feminine as having a special kind of a power. Not only the power to create, but the power to seduce. And the way in which somebody has a certain amount of power, and even with that power, they, gotta have that, yeah. You know, I'm sure it was said exactly like that. There's this idea that, we have to, that women have a certain power, and it is a power that leads us into a space that is not easily controllable, not easily plannable. And so therefore almost seems to be like, if it's not kept in its proper place and domain, or not shown its proper respect, that it could be problematic. And that gets back to the whole idea of honoring and averting. You respect something that's chaotic, and this kind of like leads into this connection with the dead. You honor this, but at the same time, it's kind of viewed as a pollution to you. It's something you want away from you. You know, you may honor your dead ancestor, but keep them over here outside of the city. We don't want the dead in our city. A lot of times you will see differences between, there's, I think it's Felipe Arias who talks about, he has a whole book on whether or not you keep cemeteries inside cities or outside cities, and how cemeteries are used. Are they places by themselves where they're quiet and that you don't disrupt? Or are they like in medieval times where you had the marketplace? How do you view the dead, right? How close are you to that? Keeping it virginal, keeping it more, there's this, the purity, the idea of keeping the pollution out. And of course, when we deal with a lot of dark goddesses, you know, a lot of times, many of them have functions in where they're sacred, but they're polluted. That's a very tantric idea, right? When we think about it in that way. But certainly, and that also kind of gets to the point of the dualism that's there. You know, when you start to move into a culture that has more dualistic thinking, that says, you know, this is good and this is evil. It's not simply a matter of there's life and death. One has to be good and the other one's not good, then it's got to be evil. And so now we start to see this association of what we're afraid of being more connected with the devil and with this idea of hell and the demonic and things like that. And of course, women as being connected to witchcraft, as you'd mentioned earlier. And again, why are women in particular connected to witchcraft? Because women seem to be connected to nature in a special way and to have a certain power over nature, if by no other thing than the virtue of the fact that they can give birth to children, and that they also have the ability to attract, to control in that way. And so, I don't know, just a very interesting outgrowth here. And kind of an interesting way that we've tangent from the whole Chthonia discussion. But it's worth thinking about the ways in which the feminine is called upon not only to protect us from evil, okay, but the way in which the feminine, in the same way as the dead, can be either honored or averted in some way, in the way that they that one would deal with it. And certainly among the ancients, you are going to call upon forces that are you're going to look to the underworld forces to protect and to help you. You know what I mean, in certain ways. So so yeah, just we're at time now. So, but there's an interesting, just kind of interesting thoughts that I had after doing that about the way, the way this idea of aversion, this connection to the dead, because really Death and the Maiden does make the case that our attitudes towards the underworld also reflect our attitudes towards the feminine. That's kind of the overriding principle. And that when you bring the idea of salvation from the dead into that you end up devaluing the feminine. Religiously and spiritually speaking, it becomes devalued because now the earth is something conquered and something subject. When you start moving the underworld to the sky, like Jake Stratton Kent said, now the earth is the place of Hecate and Physis are separated from each other, right? And Physis is this evil aspect, whereas Hecate is Hecate Soteria. She's the savior, right? Alistair says, you have to invite Shiva to the yajna, as Daksha found out. Right. Well, yeah, exactly. And wisdom of the ancestors. Yeah, very good point there, Alistair. For sure. Yeah, you can't. You have to honor. You can't just cut out and exorcise, not exercise, exorcise the things that you don't like or that you find unpleasant. It's one of the difficulties with purity. We have a culture that likes to separate things and saying that we're going to eliminate everything that we think of as impure. And again, this gets back to the idea of foreign, and we don't want foreigners, or we treat foreigners like second-class citizens, or we treat them like they're lesser than human in some way, because we are somehow averting something. And that's kind of it's something, as we consider our narratives in the culture, it's definitely something worth thinking about where we stand with that kind of a thing. Now, again, of course, my focus is always going to be on the feminine just because of the nature of this podcast, but there are many other ways that you could approach that idea and that question. And of course, I can always make the hawk for my book, Death and the Maiden, because, because this is the one where I really go into this in very, very great detail and all of these ideas. But that really came up for me recently doing the Chthonia podcast. I'm like, there's your example there of the city as the place where there's an extra need for this kind of protection or boundary against these forces that could be chaotic in some way, Yeah, because it's awesome. So yes, well, thank you guys. Thank you. And thank you so much for joining me today. I'm glad everybody could be here today, and we had some good discussion here and everything, and I always enjoy that. So thank you very much for watching, and I will try to hopefully be back next Wednesday. I don't think there'll be an issue. It might be an afternoon one like this one, but I will definitely be connecting with everybody next week for sure. So have a great rest of your week and a great weekend. And darn, too late. Sorry about that. The recording will be available very, very, in a couple minutes. So, but thank you guys all for joining me. Very much appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. And I will see you all next time.